All right, the coach is back. And this time we're going to talk about the science section of the ACT test. It's not a very popular section, mostly because it's so weird. You should become familiar with the test and learn how to do it. You should answer every question, even if you guess. Remember, you don't lose extra points for wrong answers. You have 35 minutes and 7 different passages to do. Just think about getting a lot right. It doesn't matter how many you get wrong. It's the ones you get right. Some passages are much easier than others. Find the easy questions. Okay, you're going to have 3 different types of passages. The easiest ones are charts and graphs. Typically, there are 3 of those. The next group is called experiments or research. There are typically 3 of those. And the hardest one is what I call the War of the Scientists, because it is typically 2 people arguing with words about science. The questions get harder, progressively more difficult, within each passage. So, you should grab the first few and then guess on the last ones if they seem hard and you don't know. Don't ever get bogged down on a hard question. Just get as many right as you can. Passages usually cover these areas, but you aren't expected to remember very much from them. Biology, earth science, space science, chemistry, physics. You can do very well even if you don't know any science at all. Don't be intimidated. Be detailed. The devil is in the details, which means be precise. Put on your special glasses. Look for clues. Okay, first, let's talk about charts and graphs. Every chart or graph lists things called variables. That means things that they're looking at. Look at this simple chart and graph. Here's Coach's age, Coach's height. One is plotted on the x-axis, one is plotted on the y-axis. From the example, you can see that the x-axis tracks one variable and the y-axis tracks the other. The x-axis is Coach's age in years, while the y-axis is Coach's height in feet. You have to be able to read these. The ACT usually asks 2 types of questions that go along with these charts and graphs. The first question would be, if Coach was 3 feet tall when he was 3 years old and 4 feet tall when he was 4, how tall would he be at 3.5? Do you know? Well, if you looked at the chart, you could guess 3.5 feet tall, and that would be right. Another thing they might ask is how tall Coach would be at 5 years old. And you could assume that the chart keeps going. So Coach would be 5 feet tall. Now, the next type of science question will require you to remember how to do experiments. In every experiment, there is a control group where they keep all the variables the same, and then they add variables. This is how we figure out what actually caused a change in an experiment. Sometimes they use equations in this section, but you won't have to use a calculator. In fact, you cannot. Just parts of the equation to solve the problem. All right, how do you do these? Start right in on the questions. Skim the introduction to get a feel for the area of science that you are in. But you don't want to waste your precious time reading everything. If a question refers to a specific chart or graph, put your finger on the graph to help you stay straight. Read every answer before you choose the one you think is right. Pay close attention to detail as you get your answers. Don't overthink. The third type of science question, fortunately, just shows up once in the science section. This question should be left for last, regardless of where it occurs in the test. Now, Mrs. Arts already taught you how to do these in the reading section, because they're really reading questions. We call this warring scientists, because there are usually 2 students or 2 scientists who are debating a science topic. Here's how to do one of those. Read carefully, circling nouns, as Mrs. Arts taught you, after you read the first one, write a tweet to yourself summarizing the first one. Then, do all the questions that refer to that one. Next, read the second one. Circle it up, just like Mrs. Arts told you. Then, write a tweet about that one. Then do all the questions that deal with that one. And at the end, do the ones that ask you to compare and contrast them. If you need to guess on this passage, go ahead. It usually is the toughest one to get through. Okay, let's see some examples. Here's an example of charts graphs. When heat is released from a substance burned in oxygen, scientists use a bomb calorimeter to determine the amount of heat. And it's measured in kilojoules, which is abbreviated kJ. Table 1 shows foods burned in a bomb calorimeter and how much heat is released. Table 2 shows how much heat is released when the sweetener fructose is placed in the calorimeter. Table 1 says food, mass in grams, change in water temperature in degrees Celsius, and heat released in kilojoules. Note, 2 points about the chart. The quantities may not be in ascending order. 2, the scale of the graph may be reversed. In other words, it may not start at 0 and go up. Table 2 shows you the amount of fructose and the amount of heat released. According to tables 1 and 2, as the mass of successive fructose samples increases, the change in the water temperature produced when the sample was burned most likely: A, increased only; B, decreased only; C, increased then decreased; D, remained the same. Okay, you need both of these tables to figure this out. The first table shows you that the water temperature goes up as the heat released goes up. If you look at the chart without putting it in proper order, then you could be confused. See, the heat released column is not necessarily in the right order to figure out what happens when it goes up. If you see it corresponds and think about it, anytime you add hot water to a bath, the water gets hotter. Then you know the answer is A, increased. Here's another question that asks you to use the charts together. Which of the following lists of foods from Table 1 and Table 2 in increasing order of the amount of heat released per gram of food? F, onion, egg, banana, fructose, broccoli. G, fructose, broccoli, banana, egg, onion. H, banana, broccoli, egg, onion, fructose. And J, fructose, onion, egg, banana, and broccoli. So, you first figure out which has the lowest amount of heat released per 1 gram of food. If you look at our charts, 1 gram of onion is the lowest. You have to check 1 gram of fructose, which would be 16, so it won't mess us up. From this information, you know that the answer has to be F. Just figure out the lowest one, but don't forget to check both charts. Now, one last skill. If we had to graph this on a graph, our x-axis would be the change in temperature and the y-axis would be the heat released in kilojoules, so it would look like this. Now, please graph the foods listed in Table 1. Put me on pause and draw it out. See if it looks like mine. Okay, did it look like mine? Did you place your dots on the graph and connect them? If so, it should look like this, a line going up. All right, warring of the scientists. Here's an example. There has never been absolute proof of life on Mars, though some scientists speculate that life exists there due to the planet's proximity and similarity to Earth. So here's what Scientist 1 says. In 2012, scientists in the German Aerospace Center reported that the extremophile lichen survived within the simulation time of 34 days under Martian conditions in the Martian Simulation Laboratory. A Viking Land Rover probe found that the label released, LR, experiment, that there was increased CO2 production on first exposure to water and nutrients. However, no organic molecules were released. Recently, a Mars rover analyzed a rock from Mars, and high levels of organic material were detected. These indications suggest that research should continue into this likely scenario. Okay, here's the tweet for Scientist 1. More research looks positive. Here's what Scientist 2 says. The ability to survive in an environment is not the same as the ability to thrive and reproduce in that environment. The labeled release experiment, LR, was not conclusive. Superoxides in the soil could have produced the increased CO2 without there actually being life present in Martian soil. At best, the data that we have now is inconclusive. If we are to believe that there is life on Mars, we must do more visits. Okay, the tweet for Scientist 2, need more research, doesn't look positive. Okay, here are some questions. Which statement best explains why passage 1 mentions CO2? The answers are A, high levels of CO2 are beneficial to living things. B, high levels of CO2 harm living things. C, CO2 is found on Earth. D, CO2 proves that there are live creatures on Mars. The answer? A, looks good, as it can easily be justified by the passage. Always be careful of any answer that says something proves something. That's why D does not work. Okay, here's question number 2. What is one suggestion made by Scientist 2 to explain the increased levels of CO2 in the LR experiment? F, flawed experiments. G, water and nutrients. H, rover landings. J, superoxides. If you circle the nouns like Mrs. Arts taught you, you know that the answer must be J. All right, question number 3. Both scientists would likely argue that A, more research should be done on Mars. B, no research should be done on Mars. C, Mars has life. D, Mars has no life. Okay, the easiest one to justify would be A. Saying no is too harsh. Neither passage reached a conclusion.